So we've taken from Feinberg and Willer a very elegant argument for the conclusion that cultural differences in moral psychology can explain political conflict, and moreover we can intervene in ways that will reduce the political conflict using moral reframing. I love this argument. I think it's very elegant, and there's a conclusion here that I'm somehow just inclined to believe. I'm drawn to it. But what I need to do as a philosopher, two things. I need to check that I really understand the argument, and then I need to try and see it from another perspective. I need to try and see what are some objections to this argument. Those are the things I need to do. So let's start with the argument. Here's the argument. It's on the screen. I'm not going to read it out. I want you to do something different. I want you to spend 90 seconds with your lecture buddy or lecture buddies, just first of all thinking about clarity. Right? So the first thing to think about is clarity. Is there anything here that I don't understand? Identify what that is, talk it through with your lecture buddies, and if there are any questions left over, ask them please in the live session, or ideally even in advance. Write them down for me in advance of the live session. That would be great. If you've done that and you feel like this is totally clear, then what do you think are the strongest objections to this argument? Which claims do you think can be objected to, and what are the objections? 90 seconds, go. All right, great. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you think in the way of clarificatory questions and objections. As I said a moment ago, if you can send me these in advance of the live session on Thursday, that's fantastic. That's particularly good. But I'm always interested to hear about objections and questions for clarification. All right, so where am I going to go with this? The first thing I want to say is I think it's very clear that the argument answers our question. Right? Do cultural differences in moral psychology explain political conflict on climate change? It's really claim 4, I think, that answers the question. But claim 5, which we also need, because I think this is much better supported, as it turns out, than claim 4, indicates that we might have a positive answer to this question as well. The connection here is less direct. I think 4 is direct, 5 is indirect, but we've got, I think, 2 chances to answer our question with the Feinberg Willer argument. There we are. All right. So what are the objections? Well, here's the first objection. Now, when I give you an objection, the first thing I need to do, before I tell you what the objection is even, is tell you which of the claims I'm objecting to. Now, you do the same thing for me. If you're objecting to this argument, tell me precisely which claim you're objecting to. Liberals and conservatives possess different moral profiles. I want to object to this claim. I don't want to say that the claim is false. I want to say that the justification for accepting it is inadequate. Why do I think that? Well, step back for a second and ask yourself, that claim, liberals and conservatives have different moral psychologies, is justified by some findings based on the Moral Foundations questionnaire. The Moral Foundations questionnaire is a set of questions where you ask people, to what extent do you think this is a moral consideration, or, how much would this weigh, and so on. Now, what is that questionnaire actually measuring? If we accept Moral Foundations theory, then we accept every part of that theory, which includes the social intuitionist model. The social intuitionist model says that your unreflective ethical judgments are primarily consequences of intuitive processes, and those intuitive processes reflect your moral foundations and cultural learning, right? Relatively stable cultural learning. So in this case, if we accept this, it makes perfect sense to use the moral foundations questionnaire to tap into cultural differences. Theoretically, it makes perfect sense. But if we think that moral disengagement is real, and I've argued that I think there's actually quite strong evidence for this, at least as strong as the evidence for moral foundations theory itself. And we might come at this via any range of considerations actually. If we accept this, then we have to think that unreflective ethical judgments are consequences in part of reasoning from known principles. Now, it may also be that moral foundations play a role and that intuitive processes play a role as well. It may be that those reflect cultural learning. The claim here is just that reason can at some point play some role. Right? And I think there's excellent evidence for that, including the evidence from moral disengagement that we saw earlier in the course. But in this case, the answers that you give to the moral foundations questionnaire won't necessarily reflect in any very clear or direct way anything about your culture. What we'd really need is a way to pull apart different factors that might be influencing the answer. Now, that's not to say, I think, that we shouldn't use the moral foundations questionnaire at all. It's to say that the theoretical justification for that questionnaire, to me, looks not well founded because the social intuitionist model is not well supported independently of the evidence for moral foundations theory as a whole. In fact, there's evidence against it. So what am I saying here? Well, I'm saying that I think that there's a question mark about whether we should accept this premise as something that we know. Not that we can reject it and say positively that it's false, just that the basis for accepting this using moral foundations questionnaire seems to me to depend on the idea that how people answer reflects the foundations and the cultural learning. I think it also reflects reason, so I'm much less content to think that it will be giving us evidence for this. But you might say, Steve, nah, what we've got to do is go with the evidence here. So if there's a theoretical problem and the part of the moral foundations theory doesn't seem to work, still the questionnaire has got us excellent results. Now comes objection 2, right? Because objection 2 is an objection to the idea that the questionnaire has got us excellent results. So I'm still on rejecting the basis for claim 3, that liberals and conservatives possess different moral profiles, I would say different moral psychologies. The question here is, do we have invariance? Do we have invariance? When we're using the moral foundations questionnaire, are we tapping into those 5 moral foundations? And are we doing so in the same way across all different groups that we might be interested in measuring? Right? Do the questions load onto the constructs in the same way? Well, the only case I know where this question has been answered positively in a very clear way is by Davies and colleagues, who found that there was metric invariance for gender groups. Now, metric invariance is interesting because it allows us to compare the how much variation there is in responses across groups. But it doesn't allow us to compare means. So it wouldn't allow us to conclude, for example, the fact of metric invariance wouldn't allow us to conclude, for example, that females were more concerned with purity than males on average, or conversely, because that would involve comparing means. And for that we need scalar invariance, which wasn't tested there. As far as I know, every time scalar invariance has been tested, it's not been found. And very importantly, Davies and colleagues predicted and then found support for their prediction that you would not have scalar invariance for a comparison involving a group of black people and a group of white people. They were both university students actually at their university. And they predicted this on the way that the moral foundation questionnaire was constructed, the sample that it was used, and the some cultural differences to do with relation between political identity and religion. So they found, I think, a very important case where the moral foundations questionnaire simply doesn't seem to work. What you're measuring as you cross different communities, when you observe the answers they give to the questions, seems to change, right? So it's a bit like using a pair of scales, but gravity is shifting or something like that, and the scale's not calibrated to change with shifts of gravity. Doggerel and colleagues also found metric non-invariance for a white, educated, industrialized, I forget what this is, but anyway, two groups of samples as well. So this again is a very important result, and it's even more extreme than the Davies et al. Failure. And then Irina and Sorcia, they found across a sample, I think they covered 27 countries, they found that the 5-factor model was not actually supported in many of the countries that they studied. So this is even, we don't have kind of like internal validity for the model. Things are looking extremely bad, I think, for the Moral Foundations questionnaire. That's not to say that we haven't learned things using it. Surely we have. It's not to say that the idea that we should look at cultural variations in Moral Foundations isn't important. Surely it is. But can we look at specific findings and say that we've got evidence here? Seems to me very difficult to do. So Davies and colleagues say, they put this very nicely. I think this is a good explanation. Right? This is a good explanation. They say, look, if you look across the subscale, so the one relating, for example, specifically to purity or to in-group loyalty or whatever, there were problems with scalar invariance, which suggests that researchers may need to carefully consider whether this scale is working similarly across groups before conducting mean comparisons. And this is right, carefully consider. The point is this: if you've got scalar invariance, you've got good justification for conducting a mean comparison. If you haven't, then you need some other justification. And right now, I think it's fair to say no one knows what that is. And this matters because when we look at people here who are socially liberal and compare them with people who are socially conservative, the standard Moral Foundations theory story is that as you go from being more liberal to more conservative, you are, for example, ranking purity as a higher moral priority than someone who's socially liberal. But that's a mean comparison. That's the very thing to do which we need scalar invariance. Oops. Okay. So I think this is a very serious objection. But it's not the only objection. And I've got to tell you that my favourite objection is due to 3 students who've taken the course previously. These are Joan, Lars and Joseph. All came up with this objection, I think independently. I think they came up with this independently, which I'm very pleased about. And it may well be that other people on the course, it may well be that you've seen this objection coming as well, in which case that's wonderful. Well done. It may be that there's further way to work on this objection, and that's good too. So we start with observation. This isn't the objection, this is an observation. The evidence on cultural variation says that socially conservative participants tend to regard all 5 foundations as roughly equally morally relevant. Right? So this is independent of the objection 2. What we're doing now is we're saying, suppose that we can find some justification, haven't found it yet, for doing a mean comparison. We can find some justification. In that case, what you notice here is it's not that people who are socially conservative, even at the extreme end of the scale here, it's not that they're going like, oh, it's all about purity and loyalty and fairness doesn't matter. That doesn't seem ever to be what they're saying. None of the studies I've seen anyway. They're generally saying, these things all weigh in pretty much the same, right? Loyalty to my in-group, respect for authority, those things matter, but so does harm. That's the common ground, right? That's the common ground. Very simple observation. So what we do as we move more to the right is that we find that the 5 foundations tend to get regarded as equally important rather than that some get dropped out. But in that case, we can't generate the prediction that socially conservative participants will be more likely to view climate issues as ethical issues when linked to one foundation than when linked to another. But that's exactly what Feinberg and Willer predicted. And that's exactly what Kidwell et al. 2013 again predicted. They made that prediction. But what Joan, Lars and Joseph pointed out is that you can't generate that prediction from this theory. It just doesn't follow. And I find that's a very interesting objection because it complements objection 2. If you put objection 2 and 3 together, what you get is this. We shouldn't really compare means. But if you do, you don't get the prediction. Right? You don't get the prediction that you were supposed to generate from the data that you've collected. So I think something's gone wrong here. We're left with a puzzle. Given that the evidence for cultural variation in moral psychology is at best weak, I think that's true, and given that the theoretical argument for moral reframing is flawed, I think so, why is it that moral reframing seems to work? You see, we've seen previously, and if you look at the literature, I think this will bear me out, that moral reframing seems to be highly effective. But the case for moral reframing was generated by a theory that seems both theoretically problematic and not well supported by evidence. So how does it work?